Okay, hello everyone, welcome back. This is part two of the lecture series, An Introduction to Mixed Methods Research. In this lecture, we will focus specifically on mixed methods definitions and rationales. So what we mean by mixed methods research and why any of us should even consider doing mixed methods research. So I'll start with some definitions, some simple definitions. When we talk about quantitative research, usually what we're talking about, or using the word quantitative, I should say, we're talking about numbers, some numerical representation of some kind. When we're talking about qualitative methods, we're talking about text, or it also could be photos, videos, etc. Anything that's not numeric. Okay, and when we're talking about mixed methods, we're referring to using both. So numbers and text slash photos, videos, etc. Now, these aren't very good definitions. I would agree with that, in part because it's difficult to provide a clear definition for what constitutes quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods. Generally, we should be thinking of quantitative as numbers, qualitative as non-numerical information, and then mixed methods as some sort of blending of those two. However, the exact nature of the blending and what quantitative and qualitative we're talking about is actually much more complex than it might first seem, and certainly more complex in the ways you'll often see researchers and individuals at least casually discuss these different methodological approaches. Let's start by looking at this continuum of data. So on one end, we have completely quantitative data, and on the other end, we have completely qualitative data, and we're thinking of this of data type as a continuum, right? So it's not just one or the other, but rather it's a continuum that runs from completely qualitative to completely quantitative. Now, if I present you with some kind of stimulus, such as a funny picture, this picture actually is from the first time I created these slides and taught this course in 2011 at the Society for the Study of Emerging Adulthood conference in Providence. And at that time, I just typed in funny picture into Google Images, and this was the top picture that came up. So at least in 2011, society, the culture, according to Google Images, thought that this was the pinnacle of humor in terms of funny pictures. I've kept it all these years because my colleague Maria Venquist in particular loves this picture, and so it's really kept as a tribute to her, and I haven't updated it, but I always like periodically looking and seeing what picture comes up when I Google funny picture. So I did that last night, and this was the top choice. Definitely things got more disturbing. I don't know if that's maybe reflecting some changes between 2011 and 2020 in society, but this was the top funny picture. But I don't really like that picture, so we're not going to use that. Instead, we'll use this cat. Now, if I'm presenting you with that stimulus or this frightening one, I could, and what I'm curious about is how funny you think it is, right? I want to know, how funny is this picture? There are a number of ways I could potentially assess the humor of this picture, how funny people perceive it to be. On the one end, I could have a completely quantitative assessment of how funny it is. Think for a second about what those might be. There are two that come to mind readily, or three even. First could be a reaction time, how quickly upon presentation that you laughed, so the time measured in milliseconds. It could be decibels of laughter, how loud is the laughter. It doesn't work so much watching a lecture online, but usually if I'm presenting this into a room of people, then you have a room full of laughter. And so it could be decibel levels. Another one could be some analysis of the movement of facial muscles that indicate smiling. Those are all indicators that are truly quantitative, that they have quantitative sort of underpinnings, that decibels or milliseconds all have quantitative properties. In contrast, I could ask you something truly qualitative. I could interview you about this picture. How funny do you think this picture is? Why do you think this picture is funny? Why might other people think this picture is funny? So I could learn something about how funny this picture is through asking you these questions about your subjective experience. So on the one hand, I have this subjective experience. On the other hand, I have some objective sort of quantitative measures, right? And that's often the way we tend to think about methods, that you can do it one way or another. But especially in this case, there is a middle ground, something that's not quite fully quantitative and not quite fully qualitative. I could ask you as an individual, how funny do you think this picture is on a scale of 1 to 7, from not funny at all, 1 to 7, the funniest thing I've ever seen in my life. That is assigning quantitative information, assigning numerals to underlying qualitative subjective impressions, right? The 1 through 7 values don't have any inherent meaning. They're being assigned to not funny at all through funniest thing I've ever seen in my life. And so underlying data are themselves qualitative, but we've essentially quantized those qualitative data and put them in a structure. In fact, there's still historically survey Likert scale items like that were considered structured interviews, where the question is dictated and the response options are dictated. So it's a fully structured interview, which is considered qualitative data. Over time, we've come to see those kinds of survey questions that have numerical representations as quantitative data, but really they're a mix of both. They're a way of trying to quantify our subjective experience through some arbitrary metrics. And so I use this example to be able to highlight how the idea that we have a continuum here between quantitative and qualitative data, and some of us are already working with kind of qualitative data. Even if we want to pretend like it's quantitative, it has qualitative underpinnings, and that's important to note. But the most important point in this particular section is not that per se, but rather the idea that the data that we have in hand and the way that we analyze those data should be considered as independent. Right? So we have the independence of data and analysis. Here I have this continuum of quantitative data and qualitative data, but we could add another orthogonal axis of qualitative analysis and quantitative analysis. So this suggests that the way in which we analyze our data is independent of the data themselves. Now, in reality, of course, these often do end up going together, but they don't need to necessarily. But by having these two axes that intersect, we then end up with 4 quadrants of different combinations of data and analysis. Some of them are quite straightforward. For example, if you have quantitative data and you analyze those quantitative data using quantitative analysis, some statistical analyses, then you could probably safely call that quantitative research. And that's often what we think of when we think of quantitative research, is we're talking about really that quadrant of research. Similarly, if we have qualitative data that we then analyze qualitatively, we can think of that as qualitative research. So we do some interviews, some focus groups, some observations, whatever it may be, and then those are subject to some kind of qualitative analytic framework, grounded theory, thematic analysis, interpretive phenomenological analysis, whatever it may be, right? So we're qualitatively analyzing the qualitative data. Those are very straightforward. The question is, what about these other two, where the type of analysis and the type of data are not congruent, but we're applying a different form of analysis to a particular type of data? The quadrant in the lower right is actually one that should be quite familiar. This is where we have qualitative data and we conduct quantitative analysis. This is really widespread throughout psychological research. So anytime you engage in any kind of coding of open-ended information and text that you then turn into numerical representations that are subject to subsequent statistical analysis, you're engaging in quantitative analysis of qualitative data. So we can see this in, for example, the adult attachment interview, identity status interview. These are widely used in developmental psychology research, but anything really where there's some sort of open-end response that's then taken and categorized and quantized and used subsequently in quantitative analysis. What we're talking about there is we're mixing the data source and the analysis type, right? So these two are blended. The final quadrant is much less clear, I think. When we have quantitative data, we subject that to qualitative analysis. Think for a second while I have a sip of water of what might be some examples of that. This is often difficult for people to come up with, but there are some clear ready-made examples. One is anytime, if you've ever done or seen a factor analysis or a cluster analysis or a latent class analysis or anything of that nature, where you're creating, in factor analysis, creating subscales or of different factors, or in class analysis, cluster analysis, you're creating groups of people. Those subscales and those groups of people are provided with some sort of label. There's some sort of naming process that goes on. And that naming process is really a qualitative analysis of quantitative data. If you're doing factor analysis and you have, let's say you have 60 items that supposedly measure personality traits, and you made up these items, and you run the factor analysis and you find that there are 5 factors, and let's say that something like the big 5 doesn't exist, you don't know anything about personality, or even if it does, you think, oh yeah, I should be seeing the big 5 traits. What you do is you look at the results and you see which items cling together, and then sort of squint at it and wave your hands and say, yeah, that's extroversion. That looks like extroversion. And then it gets named to be extroversion. And then you take a mean score and plug it in the quantitative analysis, and there you have your measure of extroversion. But what was the process by which the researchers actually determined that those items constituted this concept called extroversion? Really what's being done there is a form of qualitative analysis, taking some information and trying to determine, synthesize, and organize and thematize it. It's just done extremely poorly. I've never actually seen any kind of rigorous qualitative and analytic method brought to naming factors in a factor analysis. Similarly, with naming clusters in a cluster analysis, this group is high, this group is low. We call it, oh, okay, that group is disjointed. Another one is high on everything. We call that one integrated, right? We don't know that's the case at all. That's us doing a subjective kind of evaluation of those quantitative data and then assigning a term to them. So really, this is done quite a bit throughout psychological research. Is never, as far as I've seen, recognized as a form of qualitative analysis of quantitative data. But that's very much what it is. It's just doing it in a very poor way. Another example of this that's often raised by students when I give this lecture is discussion sections of manuscripts. Essentially, what a discussion section is in taking and thematizing and interpreting the results and synthesizing and trying to understand sort of some broader patterns or understandings from the quantitative data. That is really a form, it's a way of thinking about doing qualitative analysis of the quantitative data, where there's a lot of subjectivity and interpretation that goes into it, but we don't do it through any kind of systematic means. So this, I think, is really useful for highlighting how much mixed methods research we already do in our research, even those of us who might think of ourselves as purely quantitative researchers. That we could be doing quantitative research, but working in both of these question mark quadrants that involve some form of either qualitative data or qualitative analysis. But we tend to just think of it in terms of the quantitative component because that's what's done maybe at the end, or what's the focus. But there's actually a lot more mixed methods going on that we're already doing. And so it's useful in terms of thinking about, well, how do we as a field embrace more mixed methods research? First is recognizing where we're already doing it and naming it as such and thinking of it as such and conceptualizing it within a mixed methods framework. And then we can move forward, and it can be quite helpful to think about, okay, well then how do we have a productive relationship with these different methodological approaches? Okay, so rationale. So why would you potentially care to do mixed methods research? There are quite a number of reasons. I'm not going to go through all of them here, but I'm going to highlight a few that I think are particularly important or valuable to think about. One is that you need to enhance the study. You need to have something more. So this is often the case when conducting quantitative analysis, that the quantitative data are interesting and useful and they address your research question, but still seems like something is missing, that you really need to humanize the findings a little bit, that there needs to be something where you're hearing the participants' voices, that you know what they're thinking, to try to contextualize and humanize the results. And so this can be quite useful. I often give this example, it's getting quite old now, but in the US, in 2009, shortly after Obama was elected president, when they were doing healthcare reform, he was always initially talking about numbers. He was taking a very quantitative approach. This is how many people in the US are uninsured. This is how much it costs to get insurance. This is how much, it's all about the money and the numbers, how many people are denied based on pre-existing conditions. He was really providing a strong statistical quantitative argument for why we needed healthcare reform. And I always remember this example because then he was criticized quite a bit, as he was for most things, but criticized for being too quantitative, too mechanical. That really what he needed to be doing was telling people stories. He needed that human side of things to be able to convince the Americans that healthcare reform was necessary. They needed to hear the stories of individuals who were suffering or denied coverage or were struggling to get coverage at all. And so then he began to do a little bit more of that. And to me, that was just a classic mixed methods example where he really needed to enhance his argument through the use of some qualitative data. Another type of problem is you need to explain quantitative findings. Pretty much any time you do any kind of research, you're left wondering why you found what you found. Qualitative studies, and we'll talk about this more when we get into different types of designs, but qualitative studies are particularly good at seeking out potential explanations for odd observations and quantitative findings. So you find something really strange, you wonder why would that be? You follow it up with the qualitative data, and then you can sometimes get at, okay, here's what's going on there. So it can be quite useful to be able to provide those kinds of targeted studies that can help explain quantitative findings. 3 is that sometimes you need to explore qualitatively. You really don't know much about a particular topic, or maybe your information or your understanding is limited or lacking. And so it would really be helpful to try to understand the problem in a deeper way through qualitative analysis. Going back to the previous lecture and thinking about the steps in science and observation and description preceding explanation, this is an area where you really, when you're thinking about observation and description, you want to do a lot of qualitative exploration to try to better understand your construct before you go much further. 4th is the need to generalize. This isn't always a goal of research. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Especially this is often sort of presented as one differentiating features between qualitative and quantitative research, is that qualitative research is not meant to be generalizable, whereas quantitative research generally is. As you might gather from the previous lecture, I really don't like tethering concepts in this way. I tend to think that things are much more complex than that, and that if we align motives with particular methods and treat them as absolute, we're probably missing some important situations where that's not the case. And so I think it is the case sometimes that those who are working on qualitative research or using qualitative methods do want to generalize or are interested in generalizing maybe down the road. Some are and some aren't, but that's a good use of mixed methods research, where again, sort of tying it with number 3, doing a study that's more open-ended and qualitative, then following it up with a quantitative study would then allow that generalization process potentially to go a bit smoother. Yeah, that's still always, still limits in terms of how well we can really generalize given the methods that we use. But oftentimes the quantitative research can approximate generalizability much better than qualitative methods can. On that note, the 5th motivation that I think is important to consider is the need for cultural adaptation or sensitivity. So sometimes if you're interested in looking at cultural variations, cultural adaptation is often a term used in like the intervention literature. And so if an intervention was developed with one particular cultural group, to what degree will that same intervention work with some other cultural group? And qualitative analysis and methods is really a useful way to go about understanding the if and how that adaptation needs to happen. But in general, trying to understand differential processes between different cultural groups, qualitative methods are really a strong way to be able to do that. And particularly, you might potentially observe some quantitative difference between two cultural groups, and that following that up qualitatively to try to understand the source of variation of why that difference is there, as well as what the points of similarity are. Can be really, really useful. Oftentimes a lot of our quantitative approaches that we use are really not very well suited to group comparisons, because we often just don't know why those group comparisons are there, in part because we don't often include the mechanisms that would supposedly explain those group differences. And so thinking through with a mixed method study can sometimes help understand why you might observe differences or not observe differences in situations where you think that you should. A final rationale that's much broader, and I'm just going to talk about it briefly because otherwise I talk about it a lot because it's on my mind a lot, is the general sort of different crises that are going on within the field right now. Often referred to as the replication crisis, but sometimes the reproducibility crisis. Some call it a theory crisis or a measurement crisis or a validation crisis. So, you can really pick your crisis here in terms of which one you think is most important. But regardless, it's undeniable that the field in general over the last 8 years or so has been going through a period of deep reflection and examination, and trying and questioning and wondering, what has been going wrong, and have identified a number of reasons why a lot of the research that we've been producing is not reliable. And I think for me as a mixed methods researcher, part of what has come to light is being able to better demonstrate the ways in which a lot of quantitative research is also biased and fallible and has a lot of problems. Whereas historically, that the position of quantitative researchers has been one of the reasons why we don't do qualitative research is because of bias and cherry picking and so on. Those are all problems that we always knew were going on in quantitative research, but now are clear as day that we can all see it. So mixed methods research, I think in particular, some of the different designs that we'll talk about soon really help address some of these issues in terms of confidence and findings, especially if you're doing some research using quantitative methods and then you do it using qualitative methods, and they point in the same direction and giving you the same general result. That gives you some more confidence in the robustness of that finding. So it's a nice way to be able to gain greater confidence in your results, so that they aren't just based on one particular measurement instrument. But I'm not going to say much more about that. Okay, and then just to personalize a little bit, why do I personally do mixed methods research? I think I've alluded to that a little bit of why I think I do it, but in general, when I'm doing a lot of quantitative analysis, I just kind of get sad. I think I get bored, or I get distracted, or I think, man, I really wish I could just be reading some stories here. I really wish I could be getting, these numbers don't mean anything to me. I really need to get into the people's lives. It's the reason I'm doing this work, right? Is because I'm interested in people and want to understand what they're doing. And the quantitative data don't always provide that for me, right? So I get really sad. So then I do some sort of qualitative project, and that makes me sad too, because it's hard. It's time. It takes a lot of time. There are a lot of false starts. Sometimes we think we're doing something that's useful and realize that we've gone down a wrong path and that we just abandoned the whole project. It's messy. It's quite difficult. So often when I'm doing some kind of qualitative study, I think to myself, wow, it'd really be great if I could just be, doing some factor analyses right now, or doing a giant structural equation model. That's really where my heart is. I'd be really excited to be able to do that. And I feel like I'm learning more from doing that, and so on. So doing both these makes me sad, but moving between the two makes me happy. I'm able to sort of keep my mind fresh and think from a different perspective when I'm doing one or the other. It provides me, honestly prevents me from getting bored doing one thing or the other, being too frustrated with one thing or the other. So moving back and forth really just all in all sort of maintains kind of a dynamic view on the research that I'm doing. But another reason why is I really feel like mixed methods research helps facilitate a strong connection between theory and method. And that's something that I'm very interested in, that I like to think both theoretically about identity and personality and culture and things of that nature, but also think about what the different methodological tools that we use, how they feed into that theoretical development. And so really thinking about theory and method as this dialectical sort of reciprocal process. You may have seen this saying, there's nothing so practical as a good theory. It's often trotted out. It's been attributed to a number of different people. I honestly don't know who said it first. It's been attributed to Albert Einstein, John Dewey, Kurt Lewin, Leon Festinger. But anyway, it's believed to be kind of a useful saying that, especially in social psychology, it's often thrown out there, that the idea that we really do need the strong theory in the work that we're doing, because it provides guidance on how to go about doing our research. Several years ago, Anthony Greenwald published a paper where he flipped this around and called it "There's nothing so theoretical as a good method." So making essentially the complementary argument that yes, theory is useful, but our methodological work helps develop that theory, right? So without strong methods, our theories will be weak because we aren't able to refine our theoretical models using strong methodological approaches. And one analysis that he did is he looked at all the Nobel Science winners from 1991 to 2011 in a couple fields, and then looked at whether the award was given for advances in theory or advances in method. So you can think what your prior would be on that. Like, do you think most of them would be for theory or for method? I have to say, I probably think they would be largely for theory. Of course, I know the truth, and it's the opposite, that there were overwhelmingly Nobel prizes were awarded for advances in methods, not in theories. And so the argument is, of course, that theories lead to novel methods and novel findings that people can employ, but also novel methodological approaches sort of open the doors to new theoretical innovations. So methods really can help advance our theoretical work. Okay, so to wrap up this section, I think it's important to recognize that we already do more mixed methods research than we currently recognize, that it's actually there sort of lurking in the work that we do, but we just don't often take the time to reflect and think about it. There are a number of ways in which mixed methods can broaden your impact. I just identified a couple here. I'm sure you could think of more ways in which mixed methods can broaden the impact of your study. And then finally, mixed methods research really can keep you fresh. The shifting ideas and perspectives, shifting perspectives and thinking about data in different ways can lead to new ideas and new opportunities. And that's very much what I've found through my career thus far of really doing a mixed methods program of research. Okay, and with that, time for another fika. See you soon.